My parents handed my golden child brother the keys to my life savings, granting him full access to my $250,000 bank account. But when he logged into the portal right in front of our entire family, projecting the screen to steal my money, live, the balance stared back at him. $1. His smug, entitled smile instantly vanished into sheer, breathless panic. I simply dabbed the corners of my mouth with my linen napkin and watched his imaginary empire burn to the ground. If you have ever been the family scapegoat who finally decided to fight back, stay with me, because the trap I set was entirely legal and incredibly satisfying. The clink of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the low hum of jazz, playing in my parents' sprawling Atlanta dining room. I sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, watching my brother Malik rise from his chair. At 38 years old, Malik still possessed the effortless charm of a college fraternity president. He was wearing a tailored suit that I knew for a fact he could not afford, his posture radiating an unearned confidence that had been nurtured by our parents since he was a toddler. He flashed his $1 million smile at the gathered family, raising his glass of expensive champagne that my father had uncorked specifically for this occasion. Tonight, Malik announced, his voice vibrating with practiced charisma, we are not just sharing a meal, we are consolidating our legacy. We are taking the family name to the highest level of success. I kept my expression entirely neutral, my hands resting lightly on my lap. As the chief financial officer for a major technology firm in the city, I spent my days analyzing complex data, mitigating corporate risks, and spotting bad investments from a mile away. Right now, looking at my brother, all I saw was a walking, talking liability. But in this house, logic had never applied to Malik. He was the undisputed king, the son who could do no wrong, the visionary whose grandiose visions always somehow required someone else's money to materialize. My mother. Vivian sat to his right, her immaculate silk dress glowing under the ambient light of the chandelier. She was heavily involved in the elite African-American social circles of Atlanta, and she viewed our family image as her personal masterpiece. She looked around the table with a smile that was polished, practiced, and utterly devoid of genuine warmth. She set her glass down and turned her gaze toward me, her eyes hardening into that familiar, dismissive glare I had endured my entire life. Since Kendra insists on remaining single and hoarding her corporate salary, Vivian said, her voice smooth but laced with an unmistakable venom, she is generously stepping up as the primary investor for Malik's new luxury lifestyle brand. It is truly the least she can do. After all, your father and I happily paid every dime of Malik's tuition at Morehouse to ensure he had the proper network. Kendra selfishly opted to run off to an out-of-state university on an academic scholarship just to avoid her family duties. So it is only fitting that she finally gives back to the legacy we built. I did not flinch. I let the absolute absurdity of her statement hang in the air, allowing the silence to magnify her manipulation. In a single breath, my mother had completely rewritten our family history. She conveniently omitted the fact that I took that academic scholarship because they explicitly told me they would not contribute a single cent to my education. They had claimed that investing in a daughter's business degree was a waste of resources when Malik was supposedly destined to be the family mogul. For years, I had worked 2 jobs between my demanding finance classes, grinding through late nights and early mornings to build my career from the absolute bottom. Meanwhile, Malik bounced from one failed venture to another, from a flawed real estate startup to a bankrupt consulting firm, always cushioned by my parents' eager checkbook. Before I could respond to Vivian's revisionist history, my father, Desmond, cleared his throat. He sat at the head of the table, a man who demanded absolute authority and viewed any dissenting opinion as a personal insult to his position as patriarch. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick folded document. Without a word of preamble, he tossed it down the length of the table. It slid across the polished wood and landed right next to my plate with a heavy, definitive thud. I looked down. It was a comprehensive notarized power of attorney. My stomach did not drop. Instead, a cold, calculating chill ran through my veins. I recognized the document immediately. 5 years ago, I had contracted a severe life-threatening infection that landed me in the intensive care unit for 3 agonizing weeks. In my feverish, vulnerable state, terrified that I might not make it through the month, I had signed a temporary medical and financial power of attorney, naming my father as my agent, just in case the worst happened. When I recovered and was finally discharged, I immediately demanded the document back. Desmond had looked me dead in the eye and sworn he had shredded it, calling me paranoid and disrespectful for even asking. Clearly, paranoia was just another word for excellent intuition. "Your mother and I have already taken the liberty of submitting this legal directive to the bank," Desmond declared, leaning back in his chair with a look of supreme arrogance. "We authorized Malik to access your primary savings account. We are transferring $250,000 tonight to secure his future. You have been sitting on that cash doing nothing with it. Family wealth belongs to the family, Kendra. You will not hoard your resources while your brother is on the verge of greatness. We are making the executive decision for you." I slowly shifted my gaze to Chloe, my 32-year-old white sister-in-law. She sat next to Malik, swirling her red wine, a look of profound entitlement painted across her face. Chloe loved the financial benefits of marrying into a wealthy African-American family, constantly leveraging my parents' status for her own social climbing in Buckhead, all while treating me with a grating, polite condescension. She caught me looking at her and offered a small, pitying smile. "Do not be upset, Kendra," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You should be proud to help us. Malik has been so stressed about funding the brand launch. It takes a village, right? And honestly, it is not like you have a husband or children to spend that kind of money on anyway. You do not really have a family of your own to worry about." The sheer audacity of her words would have broken me a decade ago. It would have sent me retreating into my childhood bedroom to cry over my inadequacy. Now it only fueled my intense, unyielding focus. I was not the scared girl seeking their validation anymore. I was a woman who managed billion-dollar budgets. Malik, practically vibrating with excitement, pulled his smartphone from his pocket. He was a man who lived for an audience, always needing to turn his life into a spectacle. "Why just tell you about the transfer when I can show you the moment our legacy changes?" he announced. He tapped a few buttons on his screen, utilizing the screen mirroring feature to cast his banking application directly onto the massive smart television mounted on the dining room wall. The entire family turned their attention to the large screen. The banking portal loaded, projecting a bright white background that illuminated the dim room. My name was displayed prominently at the top right corner of the screen. Desmond nodded approvingly, folding his arms across his chest with a satisfied grunt. Vivian clapped her hands together in silent delight, her eyes shining with the anticipation of funding her favorite child. Chloe leaned forward, her eyes hungry for the sight of $250,000 about to be funneled into her extravagant lifestyle. Malik narrated his actions like a charismatic host on a television show. "I navigated through the security protocols this afternoon. Using the authorization Dad provided, he boasted, his thumb hovering over his phone screen. The bank accepted the power of attorney without a hitch. The funds are sitting right there in the primary holding account. All I have to do is initiate the wire transfer to my corporate account, and we are officially in business." I sat perfectly still, my breathing steady, my posture relaxed. I watched the screen with the mild interest of a spectator watching a predictable movie. Malik tapped his phone screen to refresh the account dashboard. The loading circle spun in the center of the television for 2 agonizing seconds. The tension in the room was palpable, a collective holding of breath, as my family waited for the digital confirmation of their theft. Then the numbers materialized in crisp, bold black font across the 70-inch screen. Available balance, $1.00. The silence that fell over the dining room was absolute and suffocating. The air seemed to instantly evaporate from the space. Malik stared at the television, his mouth falling open, his eyes blinking rapidly as if his vision had suddenly failed him. He frantically tapped the screen of his phone, hitting the refresh button again and again. The screen blinked, reloaded, and stubbornly displayed the exact same figure. $1. His hand began to shake. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against his porcelain dinner plate. Vivian let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Desmond sat frozen, his arrogant posture dissolving into rigid shock, his eyes darting from the screen to his son and back again. Chloe dropped her wineglass entirely. It tipped over, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth, like a spreading stain, but nobody moved to clean it up. The color drained completely from Malik's face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The charismatic, untouchable golden boy was gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified man, staring at the absolute ruins of his unearned triumph. I reached for my linen napkin, elegantly dabbing the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly beside my plate, folded my hands calmly on the mahogany table, and looked directly into my brother's terrified eyes. Did you really think a chief financial officer would not set a fraud alert on a dormant legal document? My parents invited me to a lavish family dinner only to hand my golden child brother the legal keys to my entire life savings. They sat back and smiled as he projected my bank account onto the television screen, ready to steal $250,000 right in front of my eyes. But when the page loaded, his smug grin vanished. The balance was exactly $1. He did not know that I had already emptied the account. If you want to know how a supposedly perfect family tries to bankrupt their own daughter, and how I legally destroyed their entire world in one night, listen closely. The suffocating silence in the dining room shattered the moment the reality of that single dollar fully registered on my father's face. Desmond lunged forward, his heavy fist slamming against the polished mahogany table with such explosive force that the crystal wine glasses violently rattled and tipped. Expensive burgundy spilled across the white lace runner, bleeding into the fabric like a dark stain, but nobody moved to clean it up. His face, usually a carefully maintained mask of composed authority, contorted into pure, unadulterated rage. "Where is his capital, Kendra?" my father bellowed. His deep voice echoed off the high ceilings of our Atlanta estate. "What exactly did you do with the money?" I sat perfectly still, processing his deliberate choice of words. His capital. It was my life savings. It was the result of endless 80-hour work weeks, skipped vacations, and brutal corporate negotiations. I had sacrificed my youth to build my financial security. But to my father, the wealth I generated was simply a family asset waiting to be deployed for his favored son. To him, I was not a daughter. I was a holding account. "You restore those funds right this second," Desmond demanded, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "This is financial treason against your own blood. You are deliberately trying to destroy your brother out of sheer spite." My mother quickly abandoned her poised high society persona. Vivian gripped the edge of the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wood as if she were trying to hold her crumbling world together. "Do you have any idea what is at stake here?" she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. "Malik has elite investors watching his every move. The entire Atlanta business community, people from our church members of our social clubs, they are all waiting for this brand launch. His reputation in our circle will be completely ruined if he cannot show proof of funds by Monday morning. How could you be so incredibly selfish?" I looked at my mother, marveling at the utter delusion required to turn an attempted robbery into a lecture on my selfishness. "You are talking about his reputation, Mom," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "What about my livelihood? You attempted to drain $250,000 from my personal account without a single phone call. You sat there smiling, drinking champagne, eating a dinner that I paid for while plotting to leave me with $1 to my name." I turned my gaze back to my father, who was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with indignation. "And you speak of treason, Dad. Treason is looking your daughter in the eye and weaponizing a medical document from 5 years ago to rob her blind. Do you remember when I signed that paper? I was in the intensive care unit battling a severe infection. I could barely breathe on my own. I trusted you to handle my affairs if I died. Instead, you saved it in a drawer to use as a blank check for your golden boy." Malik was pacing back and forth near the television, his hands tugging at the collar of his designer shirt as if he were suffocating. The charismatic, untouchable mogul routine had completely evaporated. "Kendra, stop playing games," he pleaded. His voice was stripped of its usual smooth arrogance, replaced by a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I need that transfer. This is not a joke. I have vendors waiting. I have luxury contractors expecting deposits. You have to move the money back." "You do not even need the money right now," Vivian interjected, tears welling in her eyes as she desperately tried to manipulate my emotions. You live in a luxury condominium. You have a massive corporate salary as a chief financial officer. You do not have a husband to answer to, and you do not have children to feed. Malik is trying to build an empire for his family. He has a wife. He has a future to secure. A good daughter, a good sister, would happily invest her surplus to uplift her family. My surplus is not a slush fund for Malik's delusions of grandeur. I fired back, my tone turning to ice. You paid for his expensive private schools. You paid his tuition at Morehouse College. You funded his failed real estate venture 3 years ago, and you bailed out his consulting firm before that. You handed him every possible advantage on a silver platter, and he still managed to squander all of it. I had to fight for academic scholarships. I worked night shifts while taking 18 credit hours just to get my finance degrees. I built my career from the absolute bottom, fighting twice as hard for every promotion in corporate America. I earned my wealth. Malik just demands his. My father stepped around the table, closing the physical distance between us. He towered over me, attempting to use the same intimidation tactics that used to terrify me when I was a teenager. You listen to me very carefully, he growled, pointing a finger inches from my face. We are your parents. We brought you into this world. We clothed you, fed you, and put a roof over your head. Everything you have is because of the discipline we instilled in you. You will not stand in my dining room and act like you are better than the blood running through your veins. I did not back away. I held my ground, meeting his furious gaze without a single ounce of fear. Providing basic necessities for a child is the minimum legal requirement of parenting, Dad. It is not an invoice that I have to pay off for the rest of my life. And you did not instill discipline in me. You instilled survival. I had to become ruthless because I learned very early on that no one in this house was ever going to protect me. Vivian began to sob loudly, burying her face in her hands. How can you be so cruel? She wailed. What will I tell Pastor Davis? What will I tell the women in my charity league? They all know Malik is launching his brand this week. We have already sent out the invitations for the launch gala. If this falls through, we will be a laughingstock. I looked at my mother, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. For years, I had held on to a tiny, fragile hope that one day my parents would see my accomplishments and feel genuine pride. I had hoped that one day my mother would look at me the way she looked at Malik. But watching her cry over her social standing while actively participating in a plot to bankrupt me, that final sliver of hope withered and died completely. Then I suggest you start drafting a very convincing apology to your guests, I said calmly. Because my bank account is closed for business. The silence that followed my declaration was heavy and absolute. My mother sat frozen in her plush dining chair, the tears of self-pity drying on her cheeks as she realized her emotional manipulation had completely failed. My father stared at me, his chest still heaving with anger, but he had no words left to hurl. He had fired his best shot utilizing parental authority guilt and raw intimidation, and I had swatted it away as effortlessly as brushing dust off my shoulder. I reached down to the floor where my structured leather tote rested against the leg of my chair. I unzipped it slowly, letting the crisp metallic sound grate against the dead quiet of the dining room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, certified legal dossier bound in heavy navy blue cardstock. It had been meticulously prepared by my corporate attorney, Jada. She was a brilliant legal mind who specialized in asset protection, and she understood exactly how toxic family dynamics could weaponize the law against successful women. I placed the heavy dossier directly on top of my father's useless, outdated power of attorney. I slid it across the mahogany table, making sure the embossed legal seal caught the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. My father looked down at the document as if it were a venomous snake. What is this? He demanded, his voice dropping to a low, defensive rumble. That is the ironclad legal wall protecting my livelihood, I replied calmly. Let me explain exactly how this works, since Malik clearly skipped the due diligence phase of his little heist. 3 months ago, my credit monitoring software triggered a high-priority alert. It flagged a soft inquiry on my primary financial profile. The inquiry did not come from a mortgage lender or a credit card company. It came from an IP address registered to Malik's luxury apartment complex. My brother got sloppy. He tried to verify my account limits, using my social security number checking to see if the well was deep enough for his next inevitable bailout. Malik swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tailored collar. He refused to meet my eyes, staring instead at the spilled red wine soaking into the white lace table runner. The second I received that alert, I continued, my voice steady and commanding the attention of everyone in the room. I called Jada. We did not just freeze the account, we engaged in a total defensive restructuring. Jada legally voided the old power of attorney you were holding on to. We filed paperwork citing potential familial financial exploitation and registered a permanent fraud flag across all major banking institutions. That piece of paper you brought to dinner tonight is completely worthless. It is legally dead. Vivian gasped again, clutching the pearls at her neck. You called a lawyer on your own family, she whispered as if I had committed the ultimate sin. You accused your brother of exploitation. I did not accuse him, Mom, I corrected her sharply. I predicted his behavior based on decades of empirical data, and tonight he proved me absolutely right. Chloe, who had been sitting in stunned silence since her outburst, finally spoke up. Her voice trembled, stripped of all its previous arrogant entitlement. Then where is the money? She asked, her eyes darting frantically from the legal dossier to my face. Where did you hide it? I did not hide it, Chloe, I said, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. I armored it. The $250,000 you plan to steal is currently secured in an irrevocable corporate trust. It is heavily fortified with dual biometric authentications and multi-factor signatory requirements. That means even if my father tried to march into a bank branch and demand the funds, or even if someone held a weapon to my head right now, that money cannot be moved. It requires both my physical presence and Jada's authorized thumbprint to initiate any transfer exceeding $1,000. You are entirely locked out. The reality of this impenetrable legal barrier finally crashed down on Malik. The initial shock that had paralyzed him suddenly morphed into a frantic, chaotic physical reaction. He began to sweat profusely. Thick beads of moisture shone on his forehead and along his upper lip. He aggressively pulled back the sleeve of his designer blazer, his eyes locking onto the face of his heavy luxury watch. His breathing turned shallow and rapid, echoing loudly in the quiet room. The charismatic, untouchable mogul facade shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. He was no longer the golden child posing for Atlanta society magazines. He was a terrified, cornered man running out of time. He slammed both of his hands onto the dining table, leaning his entire body weight toward me. Kendra, you have to undo this, he screamed, his voice cracking with a raw, unhinged desperation that I had never heard from him before. You have to call Jada right now. Wake her up. Tell her it was a mistake. You have to transfer that money into my account by midnight. My father stood up again, alarmed by Malik's sudden and complete loss of control. Malik, calm down, Desmond said, reaching out to touch his son's shoulder. We will figure this out on Monday. We can leverage the house again if we have to. Do not panic in front of her. There is no Monday, Malik shouted violently, shoving my father's hand away. The physical rejection shocked Desmond, who stepped back in sheer disbelief. Malik kept his wild, bloodshot eyes fixed entirely on me. Monday is too late, he pleaded, his chest heaving with every breath. You do not understand what is going to happen. If that $250,000 is not sitting in my primary ledger by midnight tonight, I am completely finished. It is a matter of life and death, Kendra. Call your lawyer. Get the money released right now. I did not flinch at his shouting. I did not reach for my phone. I simply sat there watching the golden boy self-destruct in real time. The grand narrative of his luxury lifestyle brand, the arrogant speeches about elevating the family legacy, the confident toasts to his brilliant future, all of it vanished in an instant. It was entirely replaced by the naked, ugly terror of a looming deadline. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the edge of the table, allowing the full, heavy weight of his panic to settle over the dining room. I narrowed my eyes, studying the sweat dripping down his temples and the frantic tremor in his hands. Midnight, I repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the cold air between us. I tilted my head, looking at him with absolute analytical precision. Why does a supposedly successful chief executive officer need $250,000 in liquid cash before midnight on a Saturday? Malik stood paralyzed, his chest heaving, completely unable to answer my question. He looked like a cornered animal staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. But before he could fabricate a lie about why he needed $250,000 before midnight, the heavy silence was violently shattered by Chloe. The polite, supportive sister-in-law routine vanished in an absolute instant. Chloe stood up so abrupt that her heavy mahogany dining chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor with a loud crack. Her face, previously arranged in an expression of smug superiority, was now contorted into a mask of feral, ugly rage. She slammed both of her hands onto the dining table, leaning toward me with a venomous glare that finally revealed her true nature. "You are just a bitter, jealous woman," Chloe spat, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "You sit in your sterile corporate office counting your pennies, and you absolutely hate that Malik has a real family. You hate that he has a beautiful wife and a life full of genuine love. You are so miserable and lonely that you are actively trying to destroy a healthy marriage just to make yourself feel powerful." I watched her tirade with the mild fascination of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. It was always fascinating how quickly entitlement turned into verbal abuse the second the word no was introduced into the equation. I did not raise my voice or rush to defend my relationship status. I simply waited for her to reveal the actual stakes of her sudden desperation. "We are supposed to close on a $2 million estate in Buckhead. First thing Monday morning," Chloe screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the dining room walls. "The brokers are demanding to see the proof of liquid funds deposited into our primary account by tonight. If the money is not sitting there, they are going to release the property to a backup cash buyer. I will not have my name dragged through the mud. I will not be embarrassed in front of my high society friends because my spinster sister-in-law decided to throw a petty temper tantrum over money she does not even use. You need to release those funds right now." I looked at the white woman standing in my parents' dining room, aggressively demanding that a black woman empty her entire life savings just so she could buy a mansion in one of the most expensive zip codes in Atlanta without facing social embarrassment. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her demand was almost poetic. I did not argue with her emotional outburst. As a financial executive, I never argue with tantrums. I argue with data. I reached back into my structured leather tote bag and pulled out a slim, bright red manila folder. I placed it on the table and smoothly slid it across the wood. It glided right through the puddle of spilled wine and stopped mere inches from Chloe's shaking hands. "While my attorney was securing my personal assets," I said, keeping my tone perfectly clinical and detached, "I decided to do a little professional digging of my own. I had Jada's investigative team run a comprehensive financial stress test on Malik's so-called empire. Go ahead, Chloe. Open the folder. Read the numbers. They do not lie." Chloe hesitated, glancing at Malik, who had turned a sickening shade of gray. He shook his head minutely, a silent plea for her to stop, but her curiosity and panic won out. With trembling fingers, she flipped open the red folder. Her eyes darted across the highlighted bank statements, tax liens, and default notices that Jada had so carefully compiled. "Malik's luxury lifestyle brand is not an empire," I announced to the room, making sure my parents heard every single word. "It is a registered shell company, currently drowning in multiple default notices. Those two brand-new Mercedes SUVs you both drove here tonight are completely leased, and the financing company is exactly 60 days past due on the payments. They are currently flagged in the system and out for active repossession. You are not buying a $2 million mansion in Buckhead on Monday morning, Chloe. You are desperately trying to cover a massive financial crater so the grand illusion of your wealth does not collapse in front of your friends." Chloe stared at the documents. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. Malik had been lying to her too, or at the very least severely hiding the catastrophic depth of their financial ruin to maintain his golden boy image at home. She dropped the folder as if the paper had burned her fingers. She looked at Malik, her eyes wide with a new terrifying betrayal. But the instinct for self-preservation quickly overtook her shock. Chloe panicked. She realized that attacking me was a dead end. My financial vault was sealed shut, and my boundaries were impenetrable. She spun around and turned her frantic attention to my parents. She lunged toward my mother, grabbing Vivian's silk-covered arm with a desperate clawing grip. Vivian recoiled, shocked by the sudden physical contact from her usually composed daughter-in-law. "You have to make her do it!" Chloe sobbed hysterically, her voice breaking into a harsh, ugly wail. "You have to make Kendra release the money right now. If she does not give us that $250,000 tonight, you are going to lose the house. We are going to lose everything." The room went dead silent again. The only sound was Chloe's frantic, gasping sobs echoing in the large space. I froze. The mathematical puzzle in my head, the one that had been missing a crucial piece all evening, suddenly locked perfectly into place. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I looked sharply at my mother, whose eyes had widened in sheer naked terror. I slowly turned my gaze to my father, who was suddenly staring at the floor, completely unable to meet my eyes. The arrogant, commanding patriarch from 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. I lowered my voice to a dangerous, steady whisper. "Why would Malik's business failure cost you your house?" The absolute silence in the dining room was deafening. My question hung in the air, thick and suffocating, waiting for an answer that none of them wanted to give. I watched my father. Desmond, a man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable strength and financial wisdom, physically shrank into his chair. The broad shoulders that usually commanded the room were slumped. He refused to look at me, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the intricate pattern of the spilled wine on the tablecloth. My mother. Vivian was trembling. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned completely white. Chloe was still sobbing softly, her mascara running down her face, the reality of her shattered Buckhead Mansion dreams completely breaking her fragile, entitled spirit. "I asked you a question, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Why does Chloe believe that Malik missing a midnight deposit is going to cost you this estate?" Malik finally broke the silence. He let out a ragged, desperate breath and sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. "Tell her," Malik muttered, his voice muffled and defeated. "Tell her what you did." Desmond slowly raised his head. The look in his eyes was a mixture of profound shame and a lingering, stubborn resentment that I was the one forcing this confession. When Malik approached us 8 months ago, Desmond began, his voice lacking all of its usual booming authority. He had an incredible opportunity. The luxury brand was ready to scale, but traditional banks were being difficult about the capital requirements. They wanted exorbitant interest rates because his previous ventures had not shown long-term liquidity. I scoffed quietly. Traditional banks were not being difficult. They were doing basic risk assessment. They saw a man with a history of bankruptcies asking for millions and rightly denied him. "I needed a guarantor," my mother blurted out, her voice high and defensive as she rushed to justify their disastrous decision. "He just needed someone to co-sign a short-term commercial bridge loan. It was only supposed to be for 6 months, Kendra. Just until the brand launched and the initial revenue started flowing in. We are his parents. It is our duty to support his vision." "You co-signed a commercial loan for a shell company," I stated, feeling the sheer magnitude of their financial illiteracy wash over me. "We did not just co-sign," Desmond admitted, the words visibly causing him physical pain. "The private lenders required tangible, unencumbered collateral to secure a loan of that size. They needed an asset with significant immediate equity." I stared at the man who had spent my entire adolescence lecturing me about fiscal responsibility. I stared at the woman who had shamed me for taking out small student loans to afford my textbooks. The pieces of the puzzle assembled into a picture so horrifyingly stupid that I almost could not process it. "You leveraged the house," I said, the realization settling like lead in my stomach. "You took this sprawling, generational, fully paid-off estate in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Atlanta, and you handed the deed over as collateral to a high-risk private lender just so Malik could pretend to be a successful mogul." "It was a calculated risk," Vivian cried out, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face. "He promised us the return on investment would be astronomical. We were building a legacy, Kendra. We were securing the family name for generations to come. We did not know the vendors would delay the launch or that the supply chain issues would drain the operating budget. We thought we had more time." "You did not have a supply chain issue," I corrected her coldly, gesturing toward the red folder still sitting in front of Chloe. "Your son has a spending issue. He used that commercial loan to lease luxury vehicles, rent out premium office space he did not need, and fund expensive dinners to keep up appearances with Atlanta society. He burned through your equity to buy a lifestyle he had not earned. And now the lenders are calling the note due. Desmond slammed his hand on the armrest of his chair, a sudden flare of his old authoritarian anger returning to mask his humiliation. "Do not sit there and lecture me in my own home," he barked. "We did what we had to do for this family, and now you are going to do what you have to do." The grace period for the loan extension expires on Monday morning. If the lenders do not receive a preliminary payment of $250,000 by midnight tonight, they will initiate foreclosure proceedings on Monday. Vivian stood up, her silk dress rustling in the quiet room. She walked around the table and stopped a few feet away from me, clasping her hands together in a posture of desperate pleading. "Kendra, please," she begged, her voice trembling with emotion. "You have the money. We know you have it safely secured in that trust of yours. You have to liquidate the funds and pay off the arrears. A daughter's duty is to protect her parents from ruin. You cannot let us become homeless. You owe us your life, and you will not let us lose our home." I looked at my mother. I looked at the tears shining in her eyes and the genuine terror written across her features. 10 years ago, seeing my mother cry would have broken my heart. I would have emptied my bank accounts, taken out personal loans, and destroyed my own future just to make her smile. But 10 years in corporate finance had taught me that enabling terrible decisions only breeds more disaster. "I owe you my life," I repeated softly, letting the words roll off my tongue. "Let us talk about my life, Mom. Let us talk about the life I actually lived in this house. While Malik was driving a brand new car you bought him for his high school graduation, I was taking the city bus to a part-time retail job so I could afford my college application fees. While Malik was failing out of his first business program and you were paying his rent to keep him comfortable, I was eating instant noodles in a cramped dorm room because you told me you could not spare $50 for groceries." I stood up from my chair, my posture perfectly straight, projecting the authority I had earned in boardrooms full of ruthless executives. "I built my wealth by working 80-hour weeks, missing holidays, and sacrificing my personal life. I earned every single dollar in that trust. You did not help me build it, and you certainly do not have the right to demand it to cover a debt you took out on your favorite child. I will not set myself on fire to keep your delusion warm. I am not paying the loan." Desmond's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He stood up so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. "You ungrateful, vindictive girl!" he shouted, his voice shaking with a terrifying, desperate rage. "You think you can just walk away and let your family be thrown onto the street? You think your fancy corporate title makes you untouchable?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone, his fingers tapping aggressively on the screen. "If you do not authorize the release of those funds right now, I am calling my lawyer. I will have him file an emergency injunction on Monday morning to freeze every single corporate asset you own. I will go to a judge and swear under oath that you embezzled family funds to seed your little trust. I will tell the court that you stole from Malik's original business accounts. We will tie you up in litigation for years until your reputation in this city is completely destroyed." He held the phone up, his thumb hovering over the call button, trying to use the absolute destruction of my career as a bargaining chip to save his own skin. He thought I would cower. He thought the threat of a public scandal would force me to submit to his authority. I did not blink. I checked my gold wristwatch, adjusting my cuffs with meticulous, deliberate care. "I was wondering when you would threaten to bring in the authorities." "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, icy calm. "But you are a little late to the party. I already called them." Desmond's thumb hovered over the screen of his smartphone, trembling violently. The arrogant threat to call his lawyer and destroy my career died instantly in his throat. He slowly lowered the device, the color draining completely from his face, until he looked gray and hollow. "You called the authorities," he whispered the words, barely making it past his lips. I kept my gaze fixed on him, my expression unyielding. "Did you really think my attorney and I would simply block a fraudulent wire transfer and go back to sleep?" When Jada voided that 5-year-old medical document, she did not just secure my accounts. She pulled the public financial records tied to the address where the inquiry originated. She pulled your records, Dad. I turned my attention to the sprawling dining room around us. I looked at the imported crystal chandeliers, the custom wainscoting, and the original hardwood floors that my grandfather had meticulously restored with his own hands decades ago. This estate was not just a house, it was a generational anchor for our family. It was the physical manifestation of my grandparents' relentless hard work during a time when African American families had to fight tooth and nail just to own property in Atlanta. And you put it up as collateral, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, devastating sorrow that cut deeper than any shouting ever could. You took the legacy that my grandfather broke his back to build, and you handed the deed over to a predatory commercial lender so your son could lease luxury cars and impress people who do not even care about him. Vivian let out a sharp, ragged sob, covering her face with her hands. It was the only way she wept into her palms. The interest rates were astronomical. No reputable bank would approve a loan of that magnitude for Malik without a physical asset backing it up. We thought the lifestyle brand would take off immediately. We thought we would pay the bridge loan back in a matter of months, and no one would ever have to know. The sheer, breathtaking gravity of their betrayal finally crashed over me in its entirety. For the past hour, I had been operating on pure corporate adrenaline, viewing this confrontation as a hostile takeover that needed to be neutralized. But hearing my mother confess the casual way they gambled our family history shifted something deep inside my chest. They did not just try to steal my money to give Malik a strategic business boost. That was the lie they had initially tried to sell me. The devastating truth was far more sinister. They tried to steal my entire life savings to save themselves from a catastrophic ruin they had willingly signed up for. They had walked into a financial slaughterhouse, handed over the keys to their own home, and when the blade finally swung down, they decided to throw me in front of it. I stared at the two people who were supposed to protect me. Throughout my childhood, I had rationalized their favoritism. I told myself that Malik simply needed more guidance, that my parents were tough on me because they knew I could handle it. I had spent years in therapy, untangling the quiet, insidious trauma of being the capable but unloved child. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer, breathtaking malice of what they had attempted tonight. They did not just favor Malik. They actively conspired to ruin me to shield him. They viewed my bank account as their emergency parachute, completely indifferent to the fact that deploying it would send me crashing to the ground. Chloe remained unnervingly quiet. She had married into this family believing she was securing a lifetime pass to elite social circles. She had tolerated Malik's arrogance because she thought it was backed by an endless supply of generational wealth. Now she was staring down the barrel of public humiliation and financial ruin. She realized she was tied to a man whose entire existence was a carefully funded mirage. The Buckhead mansion was gone. The luxury leased cars would be towed by the end of the week. Her social climbing had led her straight off a cliff. You were perfectly willing to let me lose everything, I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet resonating clearly in the dead silence of the room. I worked for 10 years to build my financial security. I saved every bonus, invested every surplus, and lived well below my means so I would never have to depend on anyone. And you, my own parents, sat down at this table tonight, poured me a glass of champagne, and smiled at me while orchestrating a plan to wipe out my entire net worth. Desmond gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he tried to summon a defense that no longer existed. "We are your family, Kendra," he rasped, though the authoritarian bite was completely gone. "We were desperate. You have the capacity to recover from a financial loss. You are young, you have a massive corporate salary, and you have time. We do not have time. If we lose this estate, we lose everything we have ever worked for. We lose our standing in the community. We lose our home." Desmond's chest heaved as he struggled to process his total loss of control. He was a man who ruled by decree, a patriarch who demanded absolute submission. For 35 years, he had operated under the assumption that I would eventually fall in line, that the ingrained cultural expectation of honoring your parents would override my financial boundaries. He was wrong. The corporate world had taught me that a bad investment is a bad investment, regardless of whether it shares your DNA. I shook my head slowly, feeling a profound, chilling detachment settle over my heart. You already lost it, Dad. The moment you signed that deed over to a high-risk lender to fund Malik's ego, you lost this house. You just did not want to face the consequences, so you decided I should pay for it. You decided my stability was a fair price for Malik's facade. Vivian looked up from her hands, her mascara smeared darkly beneath her eyes. Please, Kendra, she begged, abandoning all of her high society pride. She sounded like a terrified child. You can stop this. You can call the authorities back. You can tell them it was a misunderstanding. If you just release the funds to the lender, we can save the estate. We can put this all behind us. I promise we will pay you back. We will sell Malik's business assets. We will do whatever it takes. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was selfish, difficult, and lacking proper family loyalty. I saw the absolute desperation in her eyes, the pathetic hope that she could still manipulate my sense of duty to clean up their disastrous mess. There are no business assets to sell, Mom, I replied, my voice steady and unyielding. You know that as well as I do. Malik's company is a hollow shell, and I am not going to finance a burning building. You gambled the family legacy on a son who has never succeeded at anything requiring actual hard work, and you lost. I will not let you drag me down into the crater you dug for yourselves. The finality in my words hit them with the force of a physical blow. The absolute realization that I was not going to break, that I was not going to write a check to make their nightmare go away, settled heavily over the dining room. They had spent my entire life underestimating my resolve, assuming that deep down, I was just a desperate daughter seeking their approval. They had no idea that their constant rejection had forged me into someone completely immune to their guilt trips. The reality of their situation was unavoidable now. They had willingly walked into a trap of their own making, and the doors had just locked behind them. The silence in the dining room stretched until my mother could no longer bear the weight of her own consequences. Vivian stood up. Her silk dress rustled sharply against the heavy mahogany chair. She wiped the smeared makeup from her cheeks, her posture shifting from a defeated woman into a desperate matriarch ready to deploy her final weapon. She was going to use guilt, the same tool she had used to keep me compliant for my entire childhood. Kendra, you are going to call your attorney right now and liquidate that trust, Vivian commanded. Her voice trembled, but the entitlement layered beneath her tears was unmistakable. You are going to authorize the release of those funds and pay off the arrears on our estate. A daughter has a sacred duty to protect her parents from ruin. You owe us your life, and you will absolutely not sit there and let us become homeless. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire adolescence telling me I was difficult, selfish, and lacking proper family loyalty. I saw the absolute desperation in her eyes, the pathetic hope that she could still manipulate my sense of duty to clean up their disastrous financial mess. She genuinely believed that invoking her status as my mother would magically erase the fact that she had just tried to rob me blind. 10 years ago, seeing my mother cry would have broken my heart. I would have emptied my bank accounts, taken out predatory personal loans, and destroyed my own future, just to earn a fraction of the affection she freely poured over Malik. I would have done anything to hear her say she was proud of me. But a decade in corporate finance had taught me that enabling terrible decisions only breeds more disaster. I owe you my life, I repeated softly, letting the words roll off my tongue so she could hear exactly how hollow they sounded. Let us talk about my life, Mom. Let us talk about the actual life I lived under your roof. Vivian flinched, but I did not stop. I did not raise my voice, but every word I spoke carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a finalized audit. While Malik was driving a brand new luxury sedan you bought him for his high school graduation, I was taking the city bus to a part-time retail job just so I could afford my college application fees. While Malik was failing out of his first business program and you were secretly paying his rent to keep him comfortable, I was eating instant noodles in a cramped dorm room because you told me you could not spare $50 for my groceries. You told me I needed to learn independence. You told me that struggling builds character. I stood up from my chair. I kept my posture perfectly straight, projecting the same unyielding authority I used in boardrooms full of ruthless executives. I refused to let her tears dictate the reality of this room. Well, Mom, you were right. I continued, keeping my gaze locked firmly on hers. Struggling did build my character. It built a character so strong and so fiercely independent that your emotional manipulation bounces right off it. I built my wealth by working 80-hour weeks, missing holidays, and sacrificing my personal life. I earned every single dollar in that trust. You did not help me build it, and you certainly do not have the right to demand it to cover a debt you took out on your favorite child. Chloe let out a dramatic sob, burying her face against Malik's shoulder. She was mourning the loss of her Buckhead mansion and her high society dreams. Malik refused to look at me, staring blankly at the floor, as the reality of his failure collapsed around him. The golden child was completely speechless. "What will our community say?" Vivian wailed, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch as she tried a different angle. "What will the church say when they find out a wealthy daughter let her parents lose their generational home? You are going to let us be thrown out onto the street just to prove a point. We are your family. We are your blood. The community will say that Desmond and Vivian made a terrible real estate investment," I replied, my voice turning to ice. "They will say you gambled our family legacy on a son who has never succeeded at anything requiring actual hard work, and you lost. You willingly set this house on fire just to keep Malik warm. And now that the flames are reaching your feet, you expect me to throw my life savings into the blaze to put it out." I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the back of my chair. "I will not set myself on fire to keep your delusion warm. I am not paying the loan." The finality in my words hit Vivian with the force of a physical blow. The absolute realization that I was not going to break, that I was not going to write a check to make their nightmare go away, settled heavily over the dining room. I was denying them the one thing they felt entirely entitled to receive from me: my absolute submission. Desmond's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He stood up so quickly that his heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the floorboards. "You ungrateful, vindictive girl!" he shouted, his voice shaking with a terrifying, desperate rage. "You think you can just walk away from us? You think your fancy corporate title makes you untouchable?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone, his fingers tapping aggressively on the screen. He was cornered, and like any cornered predator, he was preparing to attack whatever stood in his way. "I am going to destroy you," my father snarled, his thumb jabbing aggressively at the screen of his phone. "I am going to call my attorney right now. We are filing an emergency injunction first thing Monday morning to freeze every single corporate asset you own." He paced heavily across the hardwood floor, using his physical size and booming voice to fill the space, a desperate attempt to reclaim the power he felt slipping through his fingers. He glared at me with a hatred so pure it took my breath away. "You think your board of directors will keep you around when a judge freezes your accounts under suspicion of wire fraud? You think your precious reputation in the Atlanta corporate sphere will survive when I tell the press that you embezzled from your own family to build your wealth? I will swear under oath that you stole the seed money for your trust from Malik's original business accounts. We will drag your name through the mud until you are unemployable in this city." I watched the faces of my family as Desmond laid out his fabricated plan to ruin my life. Vivian wiped her mascara-stained cheeks, her posture straightening as a sudden sickening spark of hope ignited in her eyes. She actually believed this would work. Chloe leaned forward, her breath hitching, looking at my father as if he were a conquering hero about to deliver her Buckhead mansion on a silver platter. They were perfectly willing, eager even, to watch me face false criminal charges and lose my entire livelihood, just so they would not have to deal with the consequences of their own financial illiteracy. Desmond pressed the speakerphone button on his device. The loud, hollow ringing tone echoed off the dining room walls, cutting through the heavy tension. He held the phone up like a weapon, waiting for his high-priced lawyer to answer, fully expecting me to break down, cry, and beg him to stop. He expected me to finally submit to his authority. I remained entirely unbothered. I sat back in my chair and looked at the man who had contributed half of my DNA. I watched him leverage my career, my freedom, and everything I had ever sacrificed for, just to cover up a catastrophic failure he had willingly enabled. I looked down at my wrist. I checked the sleek gold watch resting against my skin. I carefully adjusted the cuffs of my silk blouse, smoothing the fabric with deliberate, meticulous precision. I was wondering when you would threaten to bring in the authorities, Dad. I said, my voice cutting through the ringing of his phone like a perfectly sharpened blade. But you are a little late to the party. I already called them. Desmond's thumb jerked downward. He canceled the call instantly. The ringing stopped, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a vacuum. He stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. What are you talking about? He demanded, the authoritarian bravado completely draining from his tone. I stood up slowly, shifting my stance from defense to pure calculated offense. Did you really think a woman who manages billion-dollar healthcare budgets for a living would simply block a fraudulent wire transfer and go back to sleep? When Jada flagged your fake power of attorney 3 months ago, I did not just secure my own money. I investigated exactly why my brother was suddenly so desperate to steal $250,000. I reached down into my leather tote bag one final time. I pulled out a thick, heavy black folder. Unlike the red folder I had given Chloe, which contained basic public lines and default notices, this folder contained a forensic financial audit. I tossed it onto the dining table. It landed with a heavy thud, sliding to a stop directly in front of Malik. Malik looked at the black folder as if it were a bomb about to detonate. He shrank back into his chair, his hands shaking violently. You see, I addressed the room, my voice echoing with absolute authority. Malik is not just a failed businessman. He is a remarkably sloppy criminal. When you try to access a secure corporate trust, you leave a digital footprint. I hired a private forensic accounting firm to follow that footprint right back to Malik's primary business ledger. I tracked every wire transfer, every dummy corporation, and every offshore routing number he set up over the past 2 years. Shut up, Kendra! Malik suddenly screamed, his voice cracking in sheer terror. He lunged forward, trying to grab the black folder off the table, but he was shaking too badly to get a grip on the heavy cardstock. Do not say another word. You do not know what you are talking about. I slapped my hand down hard on top of the folder, pinning it to the table before he could take it. I know exactly what I am talking about, Malik. I fired back, my eyes locking onto his terrified gaze. You are running a localized Ponzi scheme. Vivian gasped loudly, taking a stumbling step backward. Desmond shook his head, his face twisting in aggressive denial. That is a lie, my father barked. Malik's company is struggling with cash flow, but he has elite investors. He has legitimate backing. I has nothing, I corrected my father coldly. Malik used Chloe's connections in the white high society circles of Buckhead to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in seed capital for a luxury lifestyle brand that does not actually exist. There are no products, there is no supply chain, there is no warehouse. Malik took that investor capital and used it to pay the interest on his older, aggressive commercial debts. He commingled investor funds with his personal accounts to pay for his luxury apartment, his designer suits, and Chloe's leased cars. Chloe let out a high-pitched, strangled noise. She looked at her husband with absolute horror, the realization dawning on her that the elite lifestyle she had been flaunting to her friends was entirely funded by stolen money. And then there is the matter of the midnight deadline. I continued driving the final nail into the coffin of Malik's fabricated empire. I turned my attention back to my brother. Tell them, Malik. Tell them why you specifically needed $250,000 tonight. Tell them about the escrow account. Malik buried his face in his hands, rocking back and forth in his chair. He was openly weeping now, the sound pathetic and hollow in the large dining room. Since he is suddenly too shy to speak, I will explain it for him, I said, turning to my parents. 2 weeks ago, Malik illegally dipped into a massive client escrow account to pay off a private lender who was threatening to seize his business assets. He took exactly $250,000 that did not belong to him. But here's the problem with stealing from regulated corporate escrow accounts. They are subject to automated federal clearinghouse rules. I looked directly at my father, ensuring he understood the gravity of the legal nightmare he had co-signed. A mandatory federal regulatory audit is scheduled for Malik's holding company first thing Monday morning. Because of the way weekend banking cycles operate, if that $250,000 is not replaced and settled in the escrow account, by midnight tonight, the bank's automated compliance system will flag the missing funds. It will automatically report the discrepancy to the federal authorities for embezzlement and wire fraud. Vivian's legs gave out. She collapsed heavily into her dining chair, her hands trembling as she grabbed the edge of the table for support. Desmond stood completely paralyzed, his jaw slack, the color completely washed from his skin. They had believed they were risking their house for a business venture that had hit a temporary rough patch. They had absolutely no idea they were throwing their generational wealth into a massive, highly illegal federal crime. "You did not just co-sign a bad commercial loan, Dad," I stated, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "You tied your names, your social security numbers, and your fully paid-off estate to a man committing federal wire fraud. When you authorized the bank to leverage this house, you legally became co-conspirators in his shell company." Malik finally looked up from his hands. His face was blotchy, his eyes red and swollen. "Kendra, please," he begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic, ragged whisper. "They are going to send me to prison. You have the money. You can stop this. You can wire the funds right now, and the system will balance out before Monday. I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you the company. Just please do not let me go to jail." "You do not have a company to give me, Malik," I replied coldly. "And I am not going to become an accessory to federal fraud just to save you from the consequences of your own greed." Chloe suddenly shoved her chair back and scrambled away from Malik as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. She backed up against the dining room wall, her eyes wide with panic. "I did not know anything about this," Chloe shrieked, pointing frantically at her husband. "I had nothing to do with the business accounts. I just signed the tax returns he gave me. You cannot tie me to this. I am a victim here. I am a victim of his lies." I watched the supposed perfect marriage completely disintegrate in less than 30 seconds. Chloe was already calculating how fast she could run to a divorce attorney to secure immunity from the federal fallout. She did not love Malik. She loved the illusion of Malik, and now that the illusion was a federal crime, she was ready to throw him to the wolves. I reached down and picked up my structured leather tote bag. I carefully placed the blue legal dossier and the black forensic audit back inside, zipping the bag closed with a sharp, definitive sound. Desmond stared at me, his eyes wide and hollow. "You called the authorities," he repeated, his voice shaking. "You turned your own brother in." "I did not turn him in, Dad," I corrected, pulling my designer coat over my shoulders. "Jada's investigative team is legally obligated to report instances of severe financial fraud when they intersect with our corporate protection measures." Jada submitted the comprehensive audit, including Malik's forged signatures on the escrow documents and your fraudulent loan applications, directly to the relevant federal regulatory agencies 3 hours ago. The paperwork is already in their hands. Vivian let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She looked around her beautiful dining room, looking at the crystal chandeliers and the antique furniture, realizing that all of it was going to be seized by the federal government to pay back the people her son had defrauded. I buttoned my coat, feeling an overwhelming, absolute sense of peace. For 35 years, I had allowed these people to make me feel inadequate. I had allowed them to dictate my worth based on how much I was willing to sacrifice for their golden child. But standing here watching the empire of lies burn to the ground, I realized I did not owe them a single thing. I had survived their emotional abuse, and I had protected the life I built with my own 2 hands. My father stood frozen at the head of the dining table, his thumb hovering uselessly over the screen of his smartphone. The arrogant threat to call his lawyer and destroy my corporate career died instantly in his throat. He slowly lowered the device, the aggressive flush of red draining completely from his face until he looked hollow and gray. "You called the authorities," he whispered the words, barely making it past his lips as his mind struggled to process the shift in power. I kept my gaze fixed on him, my expression unyielding and entirely devoid of fear. "Did you really think my attorney and I would simply block a fraudulent wire transfer and go back to sleep?" I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, devastating calm. "You raised me in a house where I had to fight for every single scrap of security I ever possessed. You taught me that no one was coming to save me. So when someone rattles the handle on my financial vault, I do not just change the locks. I trace their digital footsteps all the way back to their front door and I kick it down." I reached down into my structured leather tote bag for the final time. I bypassed the blue legal dossier and the red folder of public default notices. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavy black binder. It was bound in premium leather weighing nearly 5 pounds and packed with hundreds of pages of meticulously categorized financial data. I tossed it onto the center of the mahogany dining table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud, sliding to a stop directly in front of Malik. Malik looked at the black binder as if it were an explosive device about to detonate. He shrank back into his chair, his hands shaking so violently that he had to tuck them between his knees to hide the tremors. "You see," I addressed the room, projecting my voice with the absolute authority of a chief financial officer delivering a terminal quarterly report. "Malik is not just a failed businessman, he is a remarkably sloppy fraud. When you try to access a secure corporate trust using a 5-year-old medical document, you leave a massive digital footprint. When Jada flagged that soft inquiry 3 months ago, I did not just move my money. I went on the offensive. I retained an independent, highly aggressive forensic accounting firm. I paid them a premium to map out every single corner of my brother's financial universe." Vivian let out a sharp, ragged breath, clutching the edge of the table. Desmond shook his head, his face twisting into a mask of aggressive denial. "You have no right to look into his private business affairs," my father barked, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. "You are invading his privacy. He has elite investors. He has legitimate corporate backing." I reached forward and flipped open the heavy cover of the black binder. I peeled back the title page and slid a thick stack of bank statements and incorporation documents across the table toward my father. "He has nothing," I corrected him coldly. "Look at the documents, Dad. Read the numbers." Malik used Chloe's connections in the white high society circles of Buckhead to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in seed capital for a luxury lifestyle brand that does not actually exist. Chloe let out a high-pitched gasp. She looked at her husband with absolute horror, the realization dawning on her that the elite lifestyle she had been flaunting to her friends was entirely fabricated. "Malik, tell her she is lying," Chloe demanded, her voice cracking with panic. "Tell her you have the supply chain set up. Tell them about the manufacturing contracts in Europe." Malik squeezed his eyes shut and refused to speak. He could not look at his wife. "He does not have any manufacturing contracts, Chloe," I stated, systematically dismantling his entire facade. "There are no products. There is no warehouse. There is no international supply chain." Malik took that initial investor capital and immediately funneled it through a series of dummy accounts. I tracked the routing numbers myself. He set up 3 different limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Nevada, using them as shell corporations to create the illusion of legitimate operating expenses. I flipped to the next section of the binder, pointing to a series of highlighted wire transfers. He used that seed money to pay the interest on his older, aggressive commercial debts from his failed real estate ventures. He commingled investor funds with his personal accounts to pay for this luxury lifestyle you both enjoy. Your designer wardrobes, the lease payments on your matching Mercedes SUVs, the expensive dinners at the country club. All of it was paid for with stolen investor capital routed through dummy accounts. Vivian slumped back in her chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the highlighted bank records scattered across her ruined dining table. She had believed she was funding a visionary. She thought she was securing the family legacy by enabling her golden child. Now, staring at the cold, hard proof of his absolute insolvency, the illusion shattered. "But it gets worse." I continued, ensuring they understood the exact depth of the crater Malik had dug for them. Malik was bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. His dummy accounts were running dry, and his private lenders were circling like vultures. He maxed out every line of credit attached to his name. He even took out high-interest personal loans, using the fake projected revenue of his non-existent lifestyle brand as proof of income. I looked directly at my brother, who was now openly weeping, the sound pathetic and hollow in the large dining room. "You were desperate, Malik. Your creditors were threatening to seize your business assets, and your investors were asking to see product prototypes that you never developed. You had nowhere left to turn. So you went digging through Dad's home office, found that voided power of attorney, and decided that your sister's life savings would be your ultimate bailout. You do not understand the pressure I was under." Malik sobbed, his voice reduced to a ragged, desperate whisper. "Everyone expected me to be a millionaire. Mom and Dad told all their friends I was a genius. I just needed a little more time. I was going to pay you back, Kendra. I swear I was going to pay you back once the brand launched. You were never going to launch the brand, I replied, my tone devoid of any sympathy or familial warmth. You cannot launch a company when you have spent all the operating capital on your own ego. You were going to take my $250,000, throw it into the black hole of your debt, and then come back to mom and dad crying that the market had turned against you. And they would have believed you. They would have blamed me for not giving you more. Desmond stared at the forensic audit, his eyes scanning the endless rows of unauthorized wire transfers and fraudulent balance sheets. The man who had spent my entire life lecturing me about financial discipline was now staring at undeniable proof that his favored son was a massive calculated failure. "You tracked all of this?" my father asked, his voice completely hollow. "You spent months investigating your own brother just to ruin him tonight." "I did not ruin him," I fired back, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "He ruined himself. I simply gathered the receipts. As a financial executive, it is my job to identify toxic assets and eliminate liabilities before they infect the host. Malik is a toxic asset. And when I discovered the lengths he was willing to go to steal my money, I realized I could not just protect myself. I had to ensure he could never weaponize this family against me again. I closed the black binder with a loud, sharp snap. The sound made Chloe jump in her seat. She was staring at Malik with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The realization that she was tied to a man whose entire existence was a carefully funded mirage had completely broken her spirit. "You thought I was just a bitter, jealous woman hoarding my corporate salary," I said, looking around the table at the faces of my family. "You thought you could invite me to dinner, pour me a glass of champagne, and rob me blind while demanding my gratitude. But you underestimated me. You spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence and my resolve, and that was your fatal mistake." The absolute quiet in the room was no longer just the product of shock. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a family, realizing they were standing on the trapdoor of a legal execution. I kept my hand resting flat on the heavy leather cover of the black binder, feeling the solid weight of the evidence beneath my palms. "But gross financial incompetence is not a crime," I continued, my voice slicing through the stale air with the precision of a scalpel. "Being a terrible businessman who burns through his parents' home equity to lease Mercedes SUVs makes you a fool, Malik. It does not make you a felon." Malik swallowed so loudly I could hear it from across the mahogany table. He refused to look up, his chin resting against his chest as his breathing turned shallow and rapid. "If it were just a matter of bankruptcy," I said slowly, pacing the length of the dining table, "I would have simply frozen my accounts and left you to deal with the repossession agents. But when my forensic accounting team dug into your corporate routing numbers, we found something much darker than unpaid leases and fake real estate closings. We found the wire fraud." Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her chest, her manicured nails digging into the silk fabric of her dress. Desmond gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. "Fraud." My father repeated the word, stumbling out of his mouth as if he had forgotten how to speak the English language. "Yes, Dad," I replied with clinical detachment. "Federal wire fraud." Malik was not just making bad investments and hoping for the best. He was actively running a localized Ponzi scheme right here in Atlanta. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless whimper. She pressed her back so hard against the dining room wall she looked as though she was trying to phase right through the drywall. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, staring at her husband as if he had suddenly transformed into a monster. I turned my attention back to my brother. "You see, Malik ran out of legitimate commercial lenders over a year ago. When the bank stopped taking his calls, he started soliciting capital from Chloe's wealthy connections in Buckhead. He pitched them brilliant presentations, promising them exclusive early equity in his non-existent luxury lifestyle brand. But when your older, aggressive commercial creditors started threatening to seize your remaining assets, you took that new investor money and used it to pay off the old debts. You have been shuffling stolen capital from one dummy account to another for 18 months just to keep the lights on and the illusion alive." Malik buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook violently as he began to weep, a pathetic, ragged sound that stripped away the last remaining shreds of his golden boy persona. He was completely broken, exposed under the harsh fluorescent glare of his own financial data. But the house of cards finally collapsed this week. I continued my tone completely merciless. You ran out of new investors to defraud. You had aggressive lenders breathing down your neck demanding immediate payment, and you had absolutely zero liquid capital left to your name. You were cornered. I stopped pacing and stood directly across from my brother. I leaned over the table, forcing him to feel the full crushing weight of my presence. So let us talk about the midnight deadline, Malik. Malik flinched as if I had physically struck him. He curled further into himself, entirely incapable of meeting my eyes. I looked at my parents, who were watching this execution with wide, horrified eyes. When Malik was screaming and sweating earlier tonight, demanding that I release the funds by midnight, Chloe assumed it was to save their $2 million real estate closing. You both assumed it was to save this generational estate from the bridge loan default. But both of those things were absolute lies. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Malik. Tell them, I commanded. Tell your wife and your parents why you specifically needed exactly $250,000 transferred into your primary holding account before midnight on a Saturday. Malik just shook his head, sobbing into his palms, his chest heaving with panic. Since the chief executive officer is suddenly too shy to present his own financials, I will give the board the executive summary, I announced, standing tall. 2 weeks ago, in a last-ditch effort to pay off a private lender who was threatening to file an involuntary bankruptcy petition against his shell company, Malik illegally dipped into a massive client escrow account. He initiated an unauthorized transfer and stole exactly $250,000 that did not belong to him. Desmond let out a low, guttural groan. He closed his eyes, the absolute reality of his son's criminality finally crushing his authoritarian spirit. Here is the fatal flaw in stealing from a regulated corporate escrow account, I explained, relishing the absolute academic destruction of my brother. Escrow accounts are strictly governed by automated federal clearinghouse rules. They are not like personal checking accounts, where you can bounce a check, pay an overdraft fee, and apologize to the teller. They are continuously monitored by banking compliance algorithms. I paused, letting the gravity of my words settle over them like a concrete block. A mandatory federal regulatory audit is scheduled for Malik's holding company first thing Monday morning, I revealed. Because of the way weekend banking cycles operate, any transferred funds must be initiated and processed before midnight tonight to clear the system and reflect on the Monday morning ledger. Chloe slid down the wall, her knees giving out completely until she hit the hardwood floor. She sat there in her designer dress, staring at the man she had married with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. If that $250,000 is not replaced and settled in the escrow account by midnight tonight, I continued, the bank automated compliance system will trigger a critical failure. It will instantly flag the missing funds. And by 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the system will automatically generate and submit a suspicious activity report directly to the federal authorities for severe embezzlement and wire fraud. Vivian slumped forward, resting her head on the dining table as a quiet, broken wail escaped her lips. The immaculate matriarch who had spent the entire evening bragging about her family legacy to her high society friends was now weeping over a dining table stained with spilled wine. She finally realized that she had not raised a brilliant business mogul. She had raised a federal criminal. Malik slowly raised his head from his hands. His face was blotchy, his eyes red and incredibly swollen. His designer suit was wrinkled and soaked with anxious sweat. He looked absolutely pathetic. "Kendra, please," Malik begged. His voice was a raw, desperate whisper that scraped against the heavy silence of the room. "They are going to send me to federal prison. You have the money. I know you have it. You can stop this from happening. You can authorize the wire transfer from your trust right now, and the automated system will balance out before the audit triggers on Monday." He reached out across the table, his trembling hands grasping at the empty air between us. "I will do anything you want, Kendra. I will sign whatever legal documents you put in front of me. I will transfer total ownership of the company to you. I will pay you back with interest. Just please, I am begging you, do not let me go to prison." I looked at the brother who had spent my entire life taking everything I worked for. I looked at the man who had gladly accepted every financial sacrifice my parents forced upon me, who had smiled while they handed him my college tuition money, and who had gleefully attempted to wipe out my life savings less than an hour ago. "You do not have a company to give me, Malik." I replied, my voice echoing with an icy, absolute finality. You have a crime scene. And I am not going to become an accessory to federal wire fraud just to save you from the consequences of your own bottomless greed. The refusal hung in the air, cold and absolute. Malik stared at me, his tear-streaked face twisting as the realization finally took hold. The pathetic weeping brother act had failed completely. He was not going to get his bailout, and he was not going to manipulate my sense of family duty. In a fraction of a second, the desperation in his eyes hardened into pure feral rage. He was a cornered animal realizing that the only way out was blocked. You think you can just destroy me and walk away? Malik snarled, his voice dropping an octave as he shoved his heavy dining chair backward. It crashed against the hardwood floor, but he did not even flinch. He lunged across the mahogany table, his hands violently grabbing the thick black binder of forensic evidence I had placed in front of him. He pulled it against his chest, clutching it like a lifeline. I am taking this. You are not going to ruin my life over a temporary cash flow problem. Give me the rest of your files, Kendra. Hand over your laptop and your phone right now. He stepped around the table, his physical size meant to intimidate me into submission. For years, Malik had used his towering height and explosive temper to bully our parents into giving him whatever he wanted. He thought the threat of physical aggression would make me cower, that I would surrender the evidence out of sheer panic. I did not move a single muscle. I remained perfectly seated, my posture relaxed, looking up at him with a gaze so entirely unimpressed that it made him hesitate mid-step. Take the binder. Malik. I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. Take it. Throw it in the fireplace. Run it through a shredder. Eat the pages one by one for all I care. It is just paper. Malik stopped dead in his tracks, gripping the leather-bound folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. Did you honestly believe a woman who manages high-level corporate security would walk into a hostile environment, carrying the only copies of a federal fraud audit? I asked, allowing a sharp, cynical smile to cross my face. I brought that binder as a visual aid, a courtesy copy for the board of directors, so you could read along as I dismantled your life. My corporate attorney, Jada, does not operate with paper. She operates with encrypted, time-stamped digital transmissions. Malik stopped breathing. The aggressive posture dissolved, replaced by a fresh, suffocating wave of terror. At exactly 4:00 this afternoon, while I was in my penthouse getting dressed for this lovely family dinner I authorized, Jada to hit send, I announced, letting my words echo clearly off the dining room walls. Jada submitted the complete unredacted digital dossier directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the Federal Regulatory Board, managing that escrow account you raided, and the Commercial Fraud Division of the authorities. They have all your bank records. They have the routing numbers for your dummy accounts. And most importantly, they have high-resolution copies of the escrow transfer authorizations containing your forged signatures. The evidence has been in federal hands for hours. The heavy black binder slipped from Malik's trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a massive thud, the pages spilling open, displaying his financial crimes for anyone to see. He staggered backward until his shoulders hit the wall, his eyes wide, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was entirely irreversibly trapped. A sharp, agonizing wail pierced the room. Vivian's legs gave out completely. She collapsed heavily into her dining chair, sliding sideways until she was half slumped over the table. She clutched the lace tablecloth, pulling it until the spilled red wine smeared across her immaculate silk dress. My baby, Vivian sobbed, her voice raw and hysterical. They are going to take my baby away. You sent your own brother to federal prison. I turned my head slowly to look at my mother. Your baby is a 38-year-old felon who stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from a regulated corporate account. I corrected her, my tone entirely devoid of pity. And he did it to fund a luxury lifestyle that you gleefully paraded around your social circles. I did not send him anywhere. I simply handed the authorities the map to a disaster he built himself. Desmond finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. The color had not returned to his face, but a frantic, desperate survival instinct took over. He rushed to my mother's side, pulling her upright before turning a wild, pleading gaze toward me. We had nothing to do with that escrow account. My father shouted, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to distance himself from his son's criminality. We did not know he was stealing from his clients. We did not know about any dummy accounts or Ponzi schemes. All we did was sign the paperwork for his commercial bridge loan. We just put the house up as collateral to give him a legitimate boost. You have to tell the authorities that we are innocent bystanders. You have to tell them we were manipulated. I stood up from my chair, buttoning my designer coat with deliberate, meticulous movements. I looked at my father, marveling at his absolute ignorance of the legal slaughterhouse he had willingly walked into. You do not get to play the innocent bystander when your signature is on the dotted line. Dad, delivering the final fatal blow to his arrogant patriarch routine. I want you to think very carefully about the loan documents you signed to leverage this generational estate. Malik did not qualify for a multi-million-dollar commercial loan based on his charm. He secured that loan by providing the private lenders with fabricated financial statements and grossly inflated revenue projections from a lifestyle brand that does not actually exist. Desmond's eyes widened in sheer naked horror as the reality of my words clicked into place. You co-signed those fabricated documents. I continued, methodically driving the reality of their situation home. You guaranteed a fraudulent commercial loan using this very house as your backing. In the eyes of the federal government and the commercial lenders, you are not innocent victims who got tricked by a bad son. By legally tying your names, your social security numbers, and your unencumbered property to Malik's shell company, you became active co-conspirators in a massive federal wire fraud operation. Vivian let out a sound that was barely human, a choking, breathless gasp of pure terror. She looked around her beautiful, expansive dining room, staring at the crystal chandeliers, the custom wainscoting, and the antique furniture. She finally realized that her beloved estate, the ultimate symbol of her high society status in Atlanta, was already gone. It was just a matter of time before the federal government and the defrauded lenders seized every single asset she and Desmond possessed to cover the restitution. They will take the house, Vivian whispered, her eyes wide and vacant. They are going to take the house, the cars, the retirement accounts. We will have absolutely nothing. They are going to take your freedom, I corrected her coldly. The lenders will seize the estate by the end of the month to recover their stolen capital. But the federal authorities will be looking at you and Dad as accessories to embezzlement. You willingly blinded yourselves to Malik's incompetence because you wanted the prestige of raising a mogul. You handed him my medical documents, hoping to steal my life savings to cover your tracks. You built this trap, Mom. You just did not expect to be the ones caught inside it. Chloe, who had been pressing herself into the far corner of the room, suddenly let out a frantic, high-pitched cry. She scrambled away from the wall, practically sprinting toward the front hallway. I am leaving! Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing with absolute panic. I am packing my bags right now. I knew nothing about this. I just signed the joint tax returns. I am a victim of his lies. I will not go down for this. I am calling a divorce attorney the second I get into my car. She did not even look at Malik as she fled the room. The grand, supportive marriage they loved to flaunt was completely obliterated the second her financial security vanished. She was running to secure immunity, ready to throw the entire family to the wolves to save her own skin. Malik remained on the floor next to the scattered pages of the black binder. He did not chase after his wife. He did not try to argue with me anymore. The golden child was entirely broken, reduced to a hollow, shivering shell of a man waiting for the inevitable arrival of law enforcement. I picked up my briefcase, feeling an overwhelming, absolute sense of peace settle into my bones. For 35 years, I had allowed these people to make me feel inadequate. I had allowed them to dictate my worth based on how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice for their comfort. But standing here watching their empire of lies and entitlement burn completely to the ground, I realized I did not owe them a single ounce of my grief. I had survived their emotional abuse, I had protected my hard-earned wealth, and I was finally walking out of their shadow forever. The silence in the dining room was so absolute that you could hear the subtle ticking of my father's expensive grandfather clock in the hallway. I had just informed my family that the federal authorities were already in possession of every forged document, every dummy account routing number, and every piece of evidence needed to dismantle my brother's fraudulent empire. I stood by the table, my designer coat buttoned perfectly, my leather tote secure in my hand. I watched the reality of a federal prison sentence settle heavily over the room. Then the shadows in the dining room began to shift. It started as a faint, rhythmic pulsing against the sheer silk curtains of the expansive dining room windows. A stark alternating flash of sharp red and piercing blue light. The colors bled intensely through the expensive fabric, casting harsh moving shadows across the imported wallpaper and the grand crystal chandelier above us. The pulsing lights reflected brightly in the spilled red wine on the table, a glaring visual confirmation that time had officially run out. Vivian noticed it first. My mother let out a high-pitched whimpering gasp, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that her knuckles looked like polished bone. She stared at the windows, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to age her 10 years in a matter of seconds. Desmond turned his head toward the glass, his jaw hanging slack. The heavy, imposing sound of a vehicle door slamming shut echoed from the driveway, cutting through the quiet night of their exclusive neighborhood. It was followed immediately by another door slamming, and then another. The heavy, deliberate footsteps marched up the front porch stairs. They were entirely unconcerned with the prestige of the address or the wealth of the homeowners. Then came the knock. It was not the polite, measured tap of a dinner guest or a wealthy country club neighbor dropping by. It was the loud, commanding, percussive strike of federal authorities demanding immediate entry. The sound reverberated through the grand foyer and struck the dining room like a physical blow. Malik let out a ragged, terrifying sob. He scrambled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished hardwood floor, knocking his chair entirely over. It crashed loudly, but he did not even flinch. He pressed his back against the floral wallpaper, staring at the archway leading to the front door, as if the Grim Reaper himself were standing on the welcome mat. The charismatic, smooth-talking entrepreneur who had proudly projected my bank account onto the television screen just an hour ago was completely gone. He was reduced to a shivering, broken shell of a man waiting for his arrest. The meticulously curated dinner party descended into a state of absolute, unrestrained panic. The heavy oak front door was opened likely by my parents' terrified housekeeper, and the deep, authoritative voices of law enforcement officers entered the foyer. That was the exact moment Chloe's survival instinct violently overrode whatever vows she had made at the altar. The polite, supportive, entitled white woman, who had spent the entire evening demanding I hand over my life savings to fund her Buckhead mansion, suddenly realized she was about to be handcuffed. She realized that playing the loyal wife to a wealthy African-American mogul was fun until the mogul turned out to be a federal criminal. She did not just turn on Malik, she completely obliterated him. Chloe lunged forward, not to protect her husband, but to push herself as far away from him as physically possible. She scrambled to the opposite side of the room, pointing a shaking, aggressive finger right at his chest. "I knew nothing about this," Chloe screamed. Her voice was shrill, echoing wildly over the approaching footsteps of the agents in the hallway. "I knew absolutely nothing about the escrow accounts. He lied to me. He forged my signature on those tax returns. I am a victim of his manipulation. I am a victim here." She looked frantically toward the foyer, shouting her innocence to the officers who had not even entered the dining room yet. She wanted to make sure her defense was on the record the second they walked in. She looked at Malik with a disgust so pure and unfiltered it made my mother physically recoil. "You dragged me into this!" Chloe shrieked, her face flushed with panic and fury. "You told me the investors were legitimate. You told me the money was clean. I will not go to federal prison for your pathetic, incompetent business failures. I am calling my father right now and getting a divorce attorney. You are entirely on your own." Malik reached out a trembling hand toward her, begging her to stop, begging her to lower her voice so the agents would not hear her confessing his crimes aloud. But Chloe swatted his hand away as if it were coated in acid. She had married an illusion of generational wealth, and the second the illusion shattered to reveal a federal indictment, she threw him directly to the wolves without a single ounce of hesitation. Vivian tried to stand up to defend her son, to silence her daughter-in-law, but her legs refused to support her. She sank back into her chair, weeping openly, as her perfect family legacy disintegrated before her eyes. Desmond stood paralyzed, watching his daughter-in-law scream accusations that would secure his son's conviction. He was the authoritarian patriarch who always had a plan, who always commanded the room, but against the flashing red and blue lights and the heavy footsteps of federal agents, he was entirely powerless. I stood quietly near the edge of the table, perfectly composed. I watched Chloe hyperventilate and distance herself from the wreckage. I watched Malik weep against the wall. I watched my parents realize that their desperation to maintain a facade of wealth had cost them their freedom, their home, and their future. They had spent my entire life making me feel like an outsider, like a disappointment who could not measure up to the golden child. But as the authorities stepped into the dining room, badges visible and expressions stern, I was the only person in the room who had absolutely nothing to fear. The heavy footsteps in the foyer stopped just outside the dining room archway. 4 federal agents stepped into the light of the crystal chandelier. They wore dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their chests. Their presence instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. The stark contrast between their tactical gear and my mother's imported floral wallpaper was almost cinematic. The lead agent, a tall man with a remarkably calm demeanor, scanned the room. His eyes swept past my mother, who was sobbing into the lace tablecloth, past my father, who was standing frozen like a statue, and past Chloe, who was hyperventilating against the far wall. His gaze locked directly onto my brother. Malik began to shake so violently that his knees actually buckled. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany table just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The golden child, the brilliant mogul my parents had worshipped for decades, was reduced to a trembling, pathetic mess before the lead agent could even state his name or present the warrant. Malik turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and swimming with absolute terror. He abandoned all remaining dignity and threw himself at my mercy. "Kendra, please," Malik begged. His voice was a high, ragged whine that scraped against my ears. "Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we had a verbal agreement about the escrow funds. You can tell them it was an internal family loan and that I was going to pay it back on Monday." I looked at him with profound disgust. He was literally asking me to lie to federal investigators to make myself a co-conspirator in his financial crimes just to save his own skin. "Tell them you authorized the transfer," Malik pleaded, taking a desperate, stumbling step toward me. "I will give you everything. I will sign the brand over to you. I will pay you back double. Just tell them you made a mistake with the audit. Please, Kendra, I am your brother. We grew up together. You cannot let them take me away in handcuffs." I did not back away from him. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly rigid, my face a mask of absolute indifference. "I am not going to commit perjury to clean up your mess, Malik," I stated clearly, ensuring the agents in the room heard every single word. "You stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from a regulated corporate account. You forged documents. You defrauded investors. You built a house of cards, and now you are asking me to stand underneath it while it collapses. You have absolutely nothing of value to offer me." My father suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state. Desmond stepped forward, positioning his large frame between me and the federal agents. Even now, with the authorities standing in his dining room, his deeply ingrained authoritarian complex took over. He believed he could command reality to bend to his will. "Kendra, you listen to me right now," my father ordered. His voice was trembling, but he tried to force it into that familiar booming baritone he had used to control me my entire life. "You work in high-level corporate finance. You know how these people operate. You tell them this is a civil dispute. You tell them you overreacted and filed a false report." I stared at the man who had contributed half of my DNA. I watched him try to leverage his parental authority one last time. "You want me to confess to filing a false federal report?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "You can survive a corporate scandal," my father hissed, leaning in close so the agents would not catch his exact words. "You have money. You have connections. You can hire a team of lawyers to smooth over a false report. Malik cannot survive a federal prison sentence. He is not built for it. This will destroy him. You owe this family your loyalty, Kendra. You have to take the fall for this. You have to save the family name." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his demand hit me like a physical shockwave. It was the ultimate undeniable proof of exactly who my parents were. They did not just favor my brother. They viewed my entire existence, my career, my freedom, and my reputation as nothing more than a sacrificial lamb to be slaughtered on the altar of Malik's comfort. My father was looking me dead in the eye, actively demanding that I ruin my entire life, face federal perjury charges, and destroy the career I built from the ground up all so his fraudulent son could avoid accountability. Any lingering tiny fragment of a daughter's love that I might have still held for this man vanished completely. It evaporated into the cold air of the dining room, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated clarity. I looked at my father with icy finality. I looked deep into his desperate, commanding eyes, and I delivered the absolute verdict on our relationship. "I am protecting my name," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "You chose to gamble yours on a fraud." Desmond recoiled as if I had struck him across the face. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. The illusion of his power was entirely shattered. He finally understood that I was completely untouchable. The lead agent stepped forward, closing the distance between the archway and the dining table. He addressed my brother by his full legal name, instructing him to place his hands behind his back. Malik let out a devastated, broken wail. He did not resist. He simply collapsed forward, letting the agents turn him around and secure the heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp, mechanical clicking sound of the cuffs locking into place echoed loudly in the room, finalizing the destruction of the golden child. Another agent approached my parents. He calmly informed Desmond and Vivian that they would need to accompany him to the federal field office to answer questions regarding their signatures on the fraudulent commercial loan applications. My mother let out a fresh wave of hysterical sobs, burying her face in her hands, as the reality of her lost estate and impending criminal investigation washed over her. Chloe was already speaking rapidly to a third agent near the hallway, frantically spilling every single detail she knew about Malik's finances, desperately trying to trade her husband's secrets for her own legal immunity. I did not stay to watch the rest of the interrogations. I had accomplished exactly what I came to do. I reached down and picked up my briefcase. I adjusted the collar of my designer coat, ensuring it sat perfectly against my shoulders. I did not offer a goodbye. I did not offer a final glance of pity. I simply turned my back on the wreckage of my family and walked toward the foyer. As I moved down the hallway, the heavy presence of the federal agents parted slightly to let me pass. They knew exactly who I was, and they knew I was the one who had handed them the entire case on a silver platter. I walked out the front door and stepped onto the wide wrap-around porch of the generational estate my parents had foolishly thrown away. The cool, crisp Atlanta night air hit my face, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. It was incredibly refreshing. The pulsing red and blue lights from the law enforcement vehicles illuminated the manicured lawn, casting long, dancing shadows across the driveway. I walked down the brick steps, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement in a steady, confident rhythm. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I drove away from the flashing lights and the burning ruins of my parents' toxic empire, I took a deep breath. For the first time in 35 years, my lungs felt completely full. The drive back to my townhouse that night was the most peaceful journey of my entire life. I navigated through the winding, tree-lined streets of the wealthy suburbs, watching the flashing red and blue lights fade into nothingness in my rearview mirror. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for 35 years was completely gone. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the familiar nagging pressure of a daughter's obligation. I only felt the cool, crisp air flowing through the vents of my car and the absolute certainty that I had finally reclaimed my life. The following morning, the city of Atlanta woke up to a seismic shift in its social and corporate hierarchy. The fallout from my family's disastrous dinner party was not quiet. It was a spectacular, highly visible demolition. The federal authorities did not waste any time untangling the messy, fraudulent web my brother had woven. Because I had handed them a perfectly documented forensic audit, the investigation moved with ruthless surgical efficiency. By Wednesday afternoon, a federal grand jury handed down a staggering list of indictments against Malik. The charges read like a masterclass in financial ruin. Wire fraud, embezzlement from a regulated corporate escrow account, bank fraud, and the use of interstate communications to operate an illegal Ponzi scheme. The local news stations picked up the story immediately. The golden boy of our family, the charismatic mogul my parents had worshipped for decades, was parroted across television screens in a standard-issue jumpsuit. He looked exhausted, terrified, and thoroughly broken. He was stripped of his tailored suits, his luxury watches, and his unearned arrogance. His shell company was completely liquidated by the courts, uncovering a financial crater so incredibly deep it sent shockwaves through the local investor community. Chloe did exactly what I knew she would do. The woman who had spent years performing the role of the devoted, supportive wife filed for divorce before Malik even had his first official bail hearing. She recognized that the illusion of generational wealth she had married into was dead, and her instinct for self-preservation was utterly ruthless. It was not a quiet private separation. Chloe hired one of the most aggressive family law attorneys in the state and waged a highly publicized legal war to distance herself from the federal fallout. She went on a local media tour positioning herself as the ultimate victim. She stood on the courthouse steps, wearing designer sunglasses and shedding perfectly timed tears, claiming she was entirely ignorant of his financial crimes. She weaponized her vulnerability, telling reporters that she had been manipulated by a sociopathic con artist. She demanded immediate spousal support from whatever clean assets remained and pushed for a total legal separation of their liabilities. She left Malik with absolutely nothing. He sat in a federal holding facility entirely abandoned by the woman he had stolen for realizing that her loyalty had always been completely transactional. My parents faced a ruin entirely of their own making. Desmond and Vivian had gambled everything to protect their favorite child, and the house always wins. The commercial lenders did not care about Desmond's authoritarian posturing. They did not care about Vivian's tears or her standing in the church. A bad debt is a bad debt, and a fraudulent loan application is a breach of contract. When the fraudulent nature of Malik's corporate backing was exposed, the private lenders moved with terrifying speed to recover their capital. They called the massive commercial note due immediately. Because my parents had willingly signed the paperwork to put their generational estate up as collateral, they had no legal defense. The bank seized the historic Atlanta property by the end of the month. The foreclosure was brutal, swift, and entirely public. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that the day the bank sent representatives to change the locks. My mother stood on the pristine front lawn and wept uncontrollably. She watched in horror as moving trucks hauled away her imported crystal chandeliers, her antique mahogany dining table, and the expensive furniture to be auctioned off to cover the remaining restitution. The physical manifestation of my grandparents' relentless hard work, a property secured during a time when African American families had to fight tooth and nail just to own land, was erased in a single afternoon because of my parents' blind, foolish pride. Desmond and Vivian were forced to move into a modest, cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. But losing their wealth was only a fraction of their punishment. For my parents, losing their social standing was the ultimate death sentence. The elite African American circles of Atlanta are tightly knit, highly influential, and incredibly unforgiving of public embarrassment. The country club memberships they had treasured for years were quietly revoked. The exclusive charity committees my mother chaired suddenly found new leadership without even calling her. The wealthy neighbors and high society friends they had tried so desperately to impress by leveraging their home turned their backs completely. Their phones stopped ringing. Their social calendar became entirely empty. They became ghosts in a city they once believed they ruled. Desmond, a man who had spent his entire life commanding rooms and demanding absolute submission, was now a disgraced old man living in a tiny apartment with no one left to control. I did not reach out to them. I did not send money, and I did not offer sympathy. I adhered strictly to the boundary I had established on the night of the dinner party. I walked away, and I never looked back. The corporate world, unlike my family, respects boundaries, data, and risk mitigation. When the news of my brother's indictment broke, My board of directors was initially concerned about potential reputational damage. But when they realized that I was the one who had proactively identified the threat, initiated the forensic audit, and handed the evidence to federal regulators, their concern shifted to profound respect. I had demonstrated an unwavering commitment to fiduciary duty and legal compliance, proving that I was willing to neutralize a toxic asset even if that asset shared my last name. My career flourished. 6 months after the incident, I was promoted to a senior executive partnership within the healthcare network. My income increased exponentially, and my professional reputation in Atlanta was cemented as someone entirely untouchable and uncompromising. Today, I am sitting in my pristine, quiet penthouse office. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offer an uninterrupted, breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline. The city below is a sprawling, vibrant grid of constant motion and endless noise. But up here in my sanctuary, it is perfectly still. The morning sunlight catches the edge of my polished desk, illuminating the space with a warm, steady glow. I open my laptop and securely log into my personal financial portfolio. The system prompts me for my credentials. I type my secure password, answer the security questions, and provide the dual biometric authentications that Jada and I established. The portal loads smoothly, displaying a crisp, clean dashboard of my assets. I look at the numbers glowing on the screen. The $250,000, along with my stocks, bonds, and corporate equity, site safely and completely untouched. The accounts are heavily fortified, growing steadily and solely under my control. I take a slow, deep breath, allowing the reality of my security to wash over me. For the majority of my life, I believed that success was measured by how much I could achieve to finally make my parents proud. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just saved enough money, and if I just climbed high enough on the corporate ladder, they would eventually look at me the way they looked at my brother. I spent decades trying to buy love from a bank that was completely bankrupt of affection. But watching the numbers on my screen, I realized the most profound lesson of my entire journey. True wealth is not just about financial independence. Having a massive bank account gives you options, but it does not give you peace. True wealth is the absolute, unshakable peace of cutting ties with people who only value you for what they can extract. It is the clarity of knowing that you are entirely self-sufficient, that you do not need to set yourself on fire to keep someone else's delusion warm. I am not the family scapegoat anymore. I am not the backup plan, the emergency fund, or the forgotten daughter. I am the architect of my own life, and the foundation I have built is solid concrete. I smile, a genuine, quiet expression of pure contentment. I close the laptop, the screen going dark with a soft, satisfying click. I turn my chair toward the window, looking out over the endless possibilities of the city. I am safe. I am successful. And for the first time in my life, I am completely, wonderfully free. Looking back on the absolute wreckage of that evening, the most profound lesson I learned was not about corporate finance or federal law. It was a harsh realization about the dangerous myth of unconditional family loyalty. For 35 years, I operated under the exhausting assumption that my worth was directly tied to my utility. I believed that if I achieved enough and provided enough stability, my parents would finally look at me with the same fierce pride they reserved for my brother. The painful truth is that toxic family systems do not value your achievements. They only value your compliance. When you build your own success, people who are accustomed to controlling you will perceive your independence as a direct threat. They will demand that you sacrifice your hard-earned security to subsidize their poor decisions, wrapping their financial exploitation in the sacred language of family duty. My parents were perfectly willing to sacrifice my entire future and my freedom just to preserve an illusion of generational wealth. Walking away from them taught me that setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. True wealth is not merely a secured investment portfolio or a corner office in Atlanta. True wealth is the absolute peace of mind that comes from knowing you are entirely self-sufficient. It is the quiet power of refusing to set yourself on fire just to keep someone else's delusion warm. I learned that you cannot heal in the environment that broke you, and sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to simply walk out the door. Have you ever had to establish firm financial boundaries to protect yourself from toxic relatives? Share your experiences in the comments below and subscribe to join a community of women building their own unshakable independence.